Imagine this. You're mid-conversation. It started calmly, but now your pulse is faster, your tone's sharper. You're not listening anymore. You're just waiting for your turn to strike back. What changed? It's not about the topic anymore. You're not trying to understand. You're trying to win. Somewhere along the way, the conversation became a competition, and in your head, a familiar voice whispers, "Don't let them be right. Don't lose." But what if being right isn't power? What if it's insecurity in disguise? Friedrich Nietzsche believed that the need to be right, to dominate, to prove, to correct is not a sign of strength. It's a symptom of inner weakness, of ego, of fear. He wrote, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, because once you're convinced, you stop seeking. Once you feel certain, you stop listening. You become less curious, more defensive, less open, more fragile, and suddenly, every disagreement feels like a threat, not to your idea, but to your identity." Nietzsche saw this clearly. The more fragile your self-image, the more desperate you become to protect it, not with reason, but with volume, with sarcasm, with silence, with whatever you think keeps you in control. But here's the truth. If you really knew what you believed, if you were truly grounded, you wouldn't need to prove anything. You'd stay calm, quiet, still, because strength doesn't argue. It observes, it understands, and it walks away when the space turns toxic. Have you ever noticed? Some of the most aggressive people in arguments are the most insecure. They raise their voice not because they're confident, but because deep down, they're terrified of being exposed. Because if their idea is challenged, their identity shakes with it. Nietzsche believed, this is what separates strength from noise. The strong don't seek to be right. They seek to understand. But understanding requires letting go of the ego. And most people aren't ready for that. They confuse certainty with safety. They confuse being right with being in control, but all they're doing is building a cage, a mental prison where no new idea can enter. And here's the brutal irony. The louder someone argues, the less they trust their own position. Truth doesn't need to fight. Truth doesn't panic when it's questioned. Truth doesn't need to dominate. It simply is. And Nietzsche knew, when someone needs to be right, it's often because deep down, they're not sure. Because real understanding is quiet. It listens, it waits, it's patient enough to let the noise pass, and the insight land. But the ego? It doesn't wait. It wants instant control. It doesn't care about truth, only about not being seen as wrong. And so people fight, not for clarity, but for comfort. Because being wrong, that hurts, especially when your entire sense of self is built on being smart, logical, better. But Nietzsche flips that on its head. He says, maybe being wrong isn't the problem. Maybe being addicted to being right is the deeper weakness. How often do you argue in your head, long after the conversation is over? You replay what you should have said. You imagine shutting them down with the perfect line. You build a fantasy where you win, where you are sharp, untouchable. Right. Why does it matter so much? Because it was never about the conversation. It was about your sense of self. Most people don't argue to learn. They argue to protect the image they've built. The smart one, the calm one, the one who never loses. And Nietzsche saw the danger in this obsession. He called it psychological cowardice. Not cowardice of the body, but of the mind. The fear of letting go of an idea, because it would mean letting go of a part of yourself. So instead of growing, you double down. You dig your heels in. You'd rather stay wrong and certain than be unsure and free. But here's what Nietzsche offers as an alternative. Stop clinging. Stop defending. Let the idea die so you can evolve. Because ideas are not identity. They are tools. They are temporary. They are meant to change as you change. And the more you cling to a fixed worldview, the more fragile you become. When you tie your self-worth to being right, every disagreement feels like a personal attack. And suddenly, life stops being a conversation and turns into a courtroom. You're always on trial, always defending, always under threat. But when you're truly grounded in yourself, you don't need to argue. You don't need to win. You just listen, respond with clarity, and walk away if needed, with your peace intact. Because real strength isn't loud, it's unshakable. Have you ever been in a room where someone said nothing, and yet their presence shifted everything? They didn't argue. They didn't defend. They just were. Nietzsche would call that power. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that doesn't flinch. Because when you're clear within yourself, you don't need to prove anything. You don't need to force understanding. You don't need to win debates to feel valid. Real confidence is quiet, not passive. Quiet. It doesn't rush to respond. It doesn't collapse under pressure. It absorbs, reflects, chooses. And when clarity is present, there's no urgency to convince. Because convincing is what we do when we're not fully sure ourselves. Think about it. How often do you talk just to maintain control? How often do you keep the conversation going because silence would force you to sit with uncertainty? Nietzsche believed that silence is often the mark of strength, not the silence of fear, but the silence of groundedness. The person who no longer needs to be right has room to see, room to learn, room to let go. And in that letting go, they gain something most people never experience: freedom from the endless loop of reaction. Because most arguments aren't about truth, they're about ego, the need to be seen, the fear of being small, the fear of not mattering. But when you know your worth, you stop fighting for it in conversation. You don't need to be loud to be respected. You don't need to interrupt to be intelligent. You don't need to destroy someone's point to have one of your own. You become the one who listens carefully, responds rarely, and when you do speak, it lands. Because there's nothing more powerful than a voice that doesn't need to speak, but chooses to, only when it matters. When you no longer seek to be right, you start seeking something else: peace. And peace is rare, not because it's impossible, but because most people never stop defending long enough to experience it. Nietzsche believed that peace isn't the absence of struggle, it's the absence of illusion. And one of the most persistent illusions is that being right will make you whole. It doesn't. It only makes you louder. And louder isn't the same as stronger. Strength is what happens when you no longer feel threatened by disagreement. You stop feeling personally attacked every time someone challenges you. You stop needing to correct others just to feel superior. You stop making your identity dependent on being the smartest one in the room. And when that need dissolves, you reclaim something sacred: your energy. You no longer waste it in debates that go nowhere. You no longer offer your presence to people who only want to win, not grow. You no longer enter spaces where your value depends on your ability to outspeak someone else. You choose stillness, not because you're weak, but because you're done. Done explaining, done defending, done trying to prove who you are to people who never really wanted to see you. And this is where your presence shifts. You walk into a room and say little, but people notice. You speak rarely, but they listen. You don't chase attention, but you draw it. Not with your words, but with your weight, your presence, your clarity. Because when you no longer need to be right, you free yourself to be something far more powerful, real. Somewhere along the way, you realize you don't need to win. You don't need to speak first or speak loudest. You don't need to make them see it your way. You just need to know your way. Nietzsche believed that the strongest people aren't the ones who speak the most. They're the ones who no longer feel the urge to react. They've seen through the illusion. They know that most arguments aren't about truth. They're about fear. Fear of being seen as wrong. Fear of not being enough. And once that fear fades, the conversation shifts. You stop engaging to defend your ego. You start engaging to understand, or not at all. You walk away when it's not worth it. You protect your presence. You speak with precision, not for control, but from clarity. And in that shift, you don't become passive. You become unavailable to things that drain your peace. No longer trapped in the loop of proving. No longer performing intelligence. No longer reacting to everything just to feel in control. And that's when you reach the highest ground, not needing to be right to know who you are, because the need to be right was the weakness all along.